able to see the chat. I won't be able to see the chat as much, but I will encourage you all to drop questions, concerns, things of that sort in the chat. And obviously, I know that your leadership team has already talked about doing some follow up and some cool things with you. So it's really excited. So here we go. I hope everyone can see my screen. I believe you should be able to.
Yes.
But again, today we're going to talk about internal control for the out of control. Now, yesterday, Bill mentioned a lot of really, really cool stuff to you all about performance accountability, your data, and all of this stuff. Now, I want to talk about the internal controls or the frameworks, so to speak, that actually support all of that work that you have to do, not just programmatically, but fiscally as well. So on the screen, you guys, on this title slide, there are actually two pictures. You will see to the bottom left a picture of three little brown kids. They belong to me. And you'll see to the top right a picture of three lighter brown kids that belong to my friend Bill. Now, what I thought would be real cute for us to do, and we're just going to take a second, is to give you a quick, sweet story about our kids and the parameters that we've had to put around our children over the years. So, Bill, friend, I don't mind to put you on the spot. I know you thought you were going to chill today, but not much. So, if you don't mind, would you share with our friends here something cool about your little guys here, and maybe some parameters, some internal controls you've had to put in place for your kiddos?
Oh, sure. Well, thanks a lot, Crystal, and good morning, everybody. First, I want to brag that actually all three of my boys are adults and successful now, and two of them are off of my phone plan. So I feel like I've been a fairly successful parent with my wife. So little self-congratulations on that. Let me think. Internal controls. I think we had some in-house internal controls when the guys were about the age that you're looking at, related to snakes. So for a while we had snakes in the house. There's actually a couple of YouTube videos that talk about how to raise a snake that several of the kids had done. But we had a little issue with the snakes escaping. So after several escapes, one of which we could not find the snake for several days until it showed up in our bedroom closet. We had to put some internal controls on the snake program, and the snakes were sent outside. They were not allowed back in. So that was one internal control that we put on an issue. And the second one was the one child at the far right, very gymnastic. He did cartwheels through the house for about 2 years, to the point that it drove me crazy. And after that extended period of cartwheels, we had to put a little internal control on that. So we ixnayed the cartwheels through the house, outside great, but thereafter the cartwheel issue was resolved.
Amazing, amazing. I love it, Bill. Thank you. And yes, I can appreciate the maturity of children moving and getting off of your phone plan, because I will say, friends, that my kiddos are all grown now as well, and all off of my phone plan. But I will say that one of them just tried to come back home, and I'm like, wait, what? Come on now. But as far as internal controls, I will say, Bill, I think I had a similar issue to one of your kiddos. My youngest child, which is the child depicted in the middle, actually decided he was Superman one day. And he started to jump off of high furniture. He did that for quite a while, and I would always have to try to watch him. That was just my internal control, to make sure I kept my eyes glued on him, because you would never really know when he was getting ready to pounce off of something. In fact, I remember one time when I was still in school. Well, I still am in school, but when I was working on my second undergrad program, my child, within a time test that I was taking, decided to get out of bed and began to play Superman. And he actually dove off of the sofa and fell and knocked a tooth out. So, yeah, there were quite a bit of internal controls going around in my house, too many to name. But with that, friend, let's jump into this. So you're probably wondering, why is she telling me about these kids? What is going on? Well, I want you to know that much like your children or fur babies, because I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I know we love our fur babies as well. So much like your children, your program is your baby. I want you to keep that in mind today, right? Your program is your baby. You are responsible for this program. And if your program looks a hot mess, friends, others don't blame your program. They blame you because your children can't raise themselves, right? So that's going to be our theme today. The VR program as your baby and making sure you're doing all the right things to take care of your baby. So let's get into a few things. So today I want us to talk about what internal control is and why it's important for the VR program, AKA your baby. Then let's break down how different roles and responsibilities influence internal control and vice versa. And this will examine the intersection of program performance and fiscal controls, and after that, I would like us to review some common RSA findings and recommendations. And lastly, friends, we're going to discuss opportunities and next steps for effective implementation. So let's get it. So, first things first, internal control is a system. I want you to keep that in mind. Internal control is a system, not just singular activities sprinkled here and there. Because our theme is the VR program as your baby, I want you to consider the human body and the various systems and organs that help the body function. Now, an internal control system is an integration of behaviors and events to provide reasonable assurance that specific entity objectives will be achieved. Now, I put emphasis on reasonable because in life, there are no absolutes, right? We can plan until we're blue in the face and we can fall out from hyperventilation, but we can't plan for everything. So, as we progress through today's presentation, we'll talk more about the reasonableness of taking care of your baby. Okay. So, internal controls is outlined specifically in 2 CFR 200.1 and 2 CFR 200.303. 200.1 defines internal controls, friends, and 200.303 details what internal control must cover. Now, as defined, internal control are processes implemented by a non federal entity. So that's you, friends, designed to provide reasonable assurance. That's that word reasonable again, regarding the achievement of objectives in the following categories. First, effectiveness and efficiency of operations. So that's what you do. Secondly, reliability of reporting for internal and external use, or in other words, what you say you do. And lastly, compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So that's if what you say you do and say, or what you do and say rather, is actually what you're supposed to do. Okay. So keep that in mind. What you do, what you say you do, and if what you do and say are actually what you're supposed to do. And you'll see a screen or a picture rather. I have a picture on this slide of a mouse with a check mark. And I think I stole that from my friend Bill, but I have that picture because as I was having a conversation with our friend Tina throughout the months and weeks about internal control in your agency, we wanted to drive the point home that every click matters. So everything you do in your system matters, whether that be your case management system, whether that be your fiscal reporting or accounting systems, everything you do actually matters, friends. So, continuing on internal control, these are established and implemented as a measure of checks and balances to ensure proper management of the VR program. So, basically, to ensure you're taking care of your baby, right? So, internal controls serve to safeguard assets and prevent fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. So, thinking about some of the assets of your program, you might consider stuff like your staff. I hope you consider yourself, friends. You may also consider your WIOA partners, the providers, employers, and most definitely your consumers, right? So you might also consider the actual funding of your program, both at the federal and state levels. Internal control makes sure that all of these assets are protected. And so internal control includes methods and procedures that you all use to manage the day to day operations of grant supported activities, which ensure the compliance with applicable federal requirements and the achievement of your performance goals. Yesterday, Bill talked quite a bit about your performance goals and things of that sort. So we'll kind of touch on some of that again today and look at how that is related, or at least how the internal control system supports all of this stuff that you have to do. That's a lot, right? So you're talking about having to negotiate performance levels in a constantly evolving environment. And of course, collecting, tracking, and reporting on all that performance. Because it's not just what you do, but it's also what you say you do. And again, if what you do and say are actually what you're supposed to do, so, in essence, if you think about it, an effective internal control system supports and fuels all the things. Okay, so I just want to jump into this because I'm going to be honest. It is heavy. It's a lot, friends. And I'm going to try as much as possible not to make you fall out here. But this is a lot. So let's think of it like this. When we talk about developing internal controls, know that there is no standardized set of internal controls. One of the main questions I get from agencies is, what are others doing? And while I'm always about sharing is caring, right? There is no one size fits all approach because each agency is unique, friends. Your agency is unique. Take, for instance, your agency in comparison with your sister agency, New Jersey Blind. Most likely, the blind agency administers the OIB program for older individuals who are blind, as well as the Randolph Shepherd program, both of which don't apply to general agencies. And therefore, there are certain controls that they would need that you wouldn't necessarily need. Also, even within your agency, controls may and should differ by role. So, for instance, take Dina's role in comparison to a counselor's role. Dina and her team are responsible for adapting the case management system to ensure accurate reporting. So, most likely, they're going to have to access behind the scenes stuff that most people don't have access to, or at least shouldn't have. There should be internal controls for all of this, and they should be formally written. So, check this out, friends. RSA reviews your internal controls to make sure they meet the requirements under 200.1. And I know all of that federal regulatory language isn't always pretty, but that's what it is. They make sure it meets that requirement under 200.1 and 200.303. So, what do we know already about internal controls? Well, what we know, and Bill mentioned this yesterday, that it is by far the most common monitoring finding. So, out of the countless monitoring reports we've read in the TA world, I can only remember one over the last probably 10 years in which internal control wasn't cited as a finding or a recommendation at least once. So, that tells you internal controls is a big, big thing. And we're going to talk about some of those common findings later in this presentation.
Crystal, it's Bill.
Yes.
So in the chat, I did add the topical index of monitoring findings, and that's between 2017 and 2023. There's 105 internal control findings. So if
Oh, wow.
anyone's interested in just browsing findings in general or specifically internal controls, the link is in the chat.
That's amazing. Thanks, Bill, for adding that. Thank you. Okay, friends. So remember earlier, not long ago, I talked about internal controls as part of a system, right? I wanted you to think about your body or your baby's body, either way, because remember, we're talking about VR, the VR program as your baby. Well, in that system, friends, there are 5 distinct components. First is the control environment, which sets the tone for the organization. So think about the behaviors and attitudes in the organization. What's the vibe? What's encouraged and what's discouraged? Does the environment support innovation? Does the environment support efficiency? What is the culture? Keeping with our theme again, as VR as your baby, imagine your baby who doesn't smoke. Now, this is crazy, but I want you to imagine it, friends. Imagine your baby who doesn't smoke, or at least I pray no babies are out there smoking. Imagine that baby developing respiratory issues because they are around smokers, right? And I don't know if any of you actually have or have had respiratory issues, but as a child, friends, I suffered from asthma. And I'll just say this: when it's hard to breathe, everything else becomes hard as well. Thus, a healthy control environment is essential for your VR program to adequately breathe. Now, the second component of an internal control system is the risk assessment, which involves the identification and analysis of relevant risks. So, some overarching things to consider are what could and or might happen in the best and worst case scenarios. And this is from across the board, from everything from field services to data analysis and reporting to fiscal activities. What are those things that might keep you all from accomplishing your goal? This then leads us to the third component of control activities, which are the actual policies and procedures that help ensure management directives are carried out and documented. Now, friends, usually when I hear the term internal controls from people, they are actually referring to control activities. But as I've been trying to drive home already, internal control is a system. So if you skip out on that risk assessment, or if you haven't properly established a control environment, then the control activities just are going to fall short. So these control activities are actually the policies and the procedures that help, again, ensure that your directives in management directives are carried out and documented. Once you've identified the risks, your next question should be, how do we mitigate these risks? And the answer becomes the control activities. From here, friends, is your fourth component of the internal control system, and that's information and communication, which you're getting quite a bit of right now. So it simply supports the exchange of information. So, in other words, how do you ensure that people who need to know about your baby know about your baby. Oftentimes, you'll see this communication unfold, of course, in the agency's policy and procedure manuals. But you might also see this exchange in memos, in meetings, in training and professional development, such as the presentations over the last couple of days. And still, all of this may even be housed in a repository for easier access. So there are multiple vehicles and avenues that can be used. And lastly, friends, but definitely not least, is the monitoring component. And this is one that we actually see sadly slip through the cracks quite a bit. If you're not monitoring it, how do you know how effective you are? So hopefully you have a good idea about where you're going, but also consider your baselines. Where are you now? Because it's hard to get where you're going if you don't know where you're starting, right? And what and where are your milestones? These are things that you want to always be thinking when you're talking about the monitoring of your performance, of your program, of your baby, so to speak. So, I want to jump into this. And this slide, I have put a cartoon of the Boss Baby up, or an image of the Boss Baby. I don't know if any of you know the Boss Baby, but as I am a mother and a big kid myself, I still watch cartoons. Anywho, remember that internal control encompasses the processes that provide reasonable assurance that you will achieve objectives in three categories: operations, or again, what you do; reporting, what you say you do; and compliance, if what you do and say are actually what you're supposed to do. Because, friends, we don't want to be out in these streets lying, right? We don't want to be doing something and saying we're doing something, but we're not really doing it. So, all three of those things, operations, reporting, and compliance, need to align. So, to break all of this down further, let's just make it make sense for a minute. We can look at operations as the administration of the program. And when I say administration, I'm not just referencing senior management and those working closely with senior management, but I'm referring to all the various functions of your organization, which collectively help address the barriers to education and employment for individuals with disabilities, right? Then we have to consider objectives for reporting. So, how does all the work that you collectively do ensure timely and accurate reporting for the RSA 911, the RSA 17, which is a fiscal report, the ETA 9169, and I know Bill touched on this yesterday as the statewide annual performance report, and all of the various other federal and state reports that your agency may be responsible for? You need to keep in mind, how does the collective work you do contribute to reporting? And of course, how does your collective work ensure compliance with the Rehab Act, with WIOA, with the Code of Federal Regulations, and with your own agency policies? Again, these categories of objectives are executed throughout the various levels of your organizational structure, thus making internal control the responsibility of everyone in the agency. So you have your individual functions, aka the roles and responsibilities of certain positions within larger units, such as the field services unit or the fiscal unit, inside of the various divisions of a larger entity, such as in your case, DVR is housed in the New Jersey Department of Labor and Workforce Services, right? Which means that the work each and every one of you does contributes to the labor and workforce in the great state of New Jersey. So essentially, each of you is in control of internal control, like that. So, hence, me including the picture of the boss baby, because you're the boss baby. Your VR program is your baby. So now that you understand a bit more about how much your actions mean to your program, let's talk about the different types of control activities. So, first, friends, we have preventive controls. These are the actions or activities designed to keep errors or anomalies from occurring in the first place. So, friends, think supervisory approval on a new counselor's authorization. Because new counselors are still learning the ropes, having a supervisor to approve their authorizations within a certain probationary period will make it less likely that they will authorize a service erroneously, right? And you guys, you may already have this. This may be a control that you already have in place. But again, think of that as a preventive control. Then next, friends, you have detective controls, which are designed to find efficiencies and deficiencies in the agency processes. So think quality assurance review of timely eligibility determination across the agency. Now, I don't know if you remember, but yesterday our friend Bill pulled up your RSA 911 dashboard for quarter 2 of the program year, and you all had a whopping 99.8% timely eligibility rate, which is amazing. So, this is just an example of how detective controls work. They not only help you detect what might be off, but they also help you highlight what you're doing really well. So, kudos to you guys for that 99.8%. And last but not least, friends, there are corrective controls, aka corrective actions, which are designed to rectify problems in the agency's processes. So think about seeking a refund on a vendor overpayment. Because, of course, if you were only supposed to pay them $500, but you cut a check for 5,000, you gonna need that 4,500 back. I'm just saying. I mean, that ain't no chump change, friends. You're gonna need that back. So, thus far, we've talked about internal control from a regulatory perspective. But can we just be real for a minute, friends? We need internal controls because common sense ain't always coming. My grandmother used to always say that common sense ain't always coming. And you know what? The older I get, the more I realize that that lady wasn't as crazy as I thought she was. So, quick story, friends. Last year, my daughter and I were at the Seattle airport when we grabbed our check bags and headed to the rideshare pickup. So I get on the escalator to go up, and I notice that my luggage and I can't go up. So I keep trying, but I keep getting nowhere. My luggage just keeps coming back down when I finally look over to my left and I see everyone going up another escalator and just looking at me strangely. Then I realize I am trying to go up the down escalator, friends. When I tell y'all that my daughter was laughing so hard, she was laughing so hard that she was crying. But the crazy thing about it is that while she was laughing at me, she was right behind me. She was following my foolishness, which is why I can attest to the fact that common sense ain't coming. So, common sense should have told me that because no one else was going up that escalator, and neither my luggage or I was going anywhere, there was a big problem. And common sense should have told my daughter that since her mom wasn't getting anywhere on that escalator, she wouldn't get anywhere either. But I digress, okay? So check the direction of the escalator, friends. That is a lesson here. Check the direction of the escalator before getting on. Where are you going? Are you heading in the right direction? If you're trying to go up but the steps keep coming down, you're not going anywhere. And if the person in front of you isn't getting anywhere, please do not follow them. That's just a little common sense for you there. So all jokes aside, friends, back to the real stuff. Here are some examples of internal control procedures. First, at the top, I have separation of duties. Now, think the person who is creating the authorization isn't the person who is releasing payment for the authorization. Therefore, conflict of interest or even just the likelihood of making an innocent mistake decreases. Again, these may be things that you're already doing, but when we talk about implementing and developing internal control procedures, remember they need to be written, friends. So, another example would be access controls. So, think needs to know and needs to report. So, this could look like making certain fields or layouts in Aware available to some, but not to all. And this could also look like making certain fields mandatory versus making them optional. Another internal control procedure is internal audits and reviews. So, always the why for reviews is again to detect efficiencies and deficiencies in agency processes, but also consider what specifically you need to review. When or how often do you need to review? How do you need to review? So, for example, are you reviewing hard copies versus electronic copies, or are you reviewing both? And by whom? Will there be multiple people reviewing? And if so, how will inter-rater reliability be ensured? Because again, what's the point, friends, of doing all of that reviewing and you can't use the data and it's really, not valid, it's not accurate, it's not consistent, any of that. So keep those things in mind. Next, consider standardizing your documentation and forms so that everyone is on the same page, because there are very few things as frustrating as having a gazillion documents for the same thing. You guys know what I'm talking about when you have about 10 documents for the same thing that asks you the same question 50 million times. So think about that. Just think about standardizing your documentation and forms. Now, fiscally speaking, friends, consider periodic reconciliations to ensure that the amounts authorized and obligated actually match the amounts that were spent. And don't forget about approval authority. When authorizations are above a certain amount, for example, 5,000, 10,000, etc., who is responsible for ensuring that the cost is really allowable? Is it documented? Is it reasonable? Is it allocable? And is it necessary? Now, friends, I want to I want us to discuss some examples of internal control observations, recommendations, and findings from RSA monitoring. Because I want you to know this is not something that your leadership just makes up in their heads when they're telling you we need to do this, we need to check this. These are actually real things that are happening. And I want to make sure that everyone, again, is on the same page and you understand the role you play in taking care of your baby. So let's think about critical areas for internal control. One of them being ensuring and documenting that all obligations occur within the appropriate period of performance and are liquidated against the appropriate grant award within the period of performance. Now, if you're not fiscal, you're probably thinking, oh, well, fiscal takes care of that. Yeah, fiscal does do the reporting and pay out things and things of that sort. But friends, those of you who are in the field, if you think about it, you cannot control the purse. You are the one authorizing the services, counselors. So, to an extent, you need to understand that you're operating within a certain time period as well. You have a great responsibility here. You have to know which budget you can and can't use. Dina and team might work with the fiscal staff to adapt aware in such a way that field staff can only use certain budgets for certain services at certain times. And then even Tina and team might work with the field staff and fiscal staff to review open or outstanding authorizations. I mean, there are various things you can do. So you see, everyone might have a part in this. Now, another critical area for internal controls, friends, is going to be reporting allowable and accurate expenditures and submitting timely and accurate financial supports. This is closely related to the first point that multiple people need to collaborate for this to happen effectively. Other critical areas for internal controls, because I want you to make sure that you are considering these things, that you have these in place. Some things you want to consider include the requirements and the responsibilities for non-federal share. So also, you want to consider things like counselors authorizing services and equipment. And you want to consider contract monitoring for all contracts, not just for vendors, friends. Because if we're honest, friends, an IPE is a contract, right? Which is the agency should be frequently monitoring the activities on the plan because you have entered into a contract with that participant. And an authorization is essentially a contract as well, which is why before paying for a service, the agency should be collecting invoices, statements, and reports to ensure the terms of service have been met. And again, friends, you shouldn't just be doing this. All of this needs to be written somewhere. So make sure you have internal controls for file documentation. And I know this slide is very wordy, friends, but I wanted to make sure that when I leave you, you have all of these things to consider. So the regulations at 34 CFR 361.47A state that you must maintain for each applicant and eligible individual a record of services that includes, to the extent pertinent, documentation, including but not limited to the individual's application for VR services, the individual's IPE, and information related to closing the service record of an individual who achieves an employment outcome. So, first, formally develop internal control policies and procedures to adhere where necessary, meaning make sure that your internal controls, again, are written, friends. Review any internal controls you have already in place. So review them to make sure they're effective and adjust them as accordingly and as necessary. And lastly, review current mechanisms that you can use to collect and aggregate the results of these reviews. And this is going to help you inform the training and the evaluation of your staff. And when I tell you these are things that RSA look at, yes, they do look at this, friends. So I just want to stop for a minute because I have inundated you with a lot of information here and still got a lot of more information to inundate you with. But is everyone good so far? Are there any burning questions? There may be some later, but I can't see the chat, so I just kind of wanted to stop for a minute. Tina, we good?
Yeah, I was gonna say we haven't seen anything come through the chat, but please feel free to use the chat for your questions. But looks like you're good to continue.
Okay, awesome. So another thing, friends, you want to make sure that you have internal controls for reporting accuracy. Now, this is required by 34 CFR 361.12. Start by evaluating, developing, and implementing changes as necessary to ensure accurate data collection. This is always going to be critical because, again, it's not just what you say, friends, but or excuse me, I said that backwards. It's not just what you do, but it's actually what you say. And if what you say is actually what you're doing. So ensure that accurate data collection in your case and fiscal management systems. And then from there, you want to develop and implement internal controls to ensure information reported on those required reports, such as RSA 911 and the RSA 17, is supported with accurate documentation. And I know this is something that Bill is going to deep dive into a bit more next week when he talks about the data validation piece of internal controls. So going on, friends, here's just a quick example of how you can evaluate your reporting accuracy. So on this slide, I actually have a picture of, or at least a little screenshot of your Q2 data dashboard. And I know yesterday Bill pulled some of this up for you. The crazy part about this, friends, is that this morning, right before jumping on this training, Q3 came out. And we have been waiting like on pins and needles for Q3. Bill and I have been talking about when is Q3 coming. It came out this morning, but unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to just really dig into your data or anything. So we're still going to kind of look at Q2 for the purposes of this training. And going forward, you can look at your Q3 and your Q4 and so forth and so forth. So your Q2 data dashboard for this program year, friends, shows that 2 individuals received 4-year college or university training services, and 65 individuals received occupational or vocational training services. Now, keep in mind that this is just for Q2. With that, your data also shows that in Q2, 1,600 participants were actually eligible for an MSG. So that could, of course, include active participants who received training services in previous quarters. But of those 1,600, only 200 or 12.5%, friends, were eligible, who were eligible for an MSG, actually received an MSG during Q2. So what is the data telling us here? This is where you just get curious and ask questions, because I always tell people data is not necessarily a negative or a positive. Data doesn't have an opinion either way. It's just numbers. It's just the stats. So this is where you start to ask questions. Did staff report all training services in the correct places within Aware? Is Aware adapted properly on the back end? So for Dina and team, thinking lookup tables, system master tables, stored procedures, etc. Is all of that adapted so that staff can actually collect that properly? Were all of the MSGs actually reported, or did some kind of slip through the crack? And another question you might want to ask when you see stuff like this, friends, because I think it's important to make sure you're tying program and performance to fiscal. Make sure all of these pieces are fitting together. So another question that you might want to ask here is, how does what was reported for performance, so how does training services, MSGs, credentials, all of that stuff, how does that align with the dollars spent for training services? So think return on investment. In other words, did you get the bang for your buck? So another thing that you want to consider, friends, is, again, internal controls for contracts. We've already touched on this briefly, but just make sure that you have controls in place. Remember that all the decisions affecting eligibility for VR services, the nature and scope of available services, and the provision of these services belong solely, and I put a great emphasis on solely, to your agency. Also, the allocation and expenditure of VR funds belong to your agency, which is why internal control in this area is, again, so critical, because your providers, your partners, and even the participants should not be dictating how the VR funds are allocated and spent. The buck stops with you, friends. Again, this is your baby. So more into contracts, because there obviously is a lot when we start talking about contracts. This means that you need to establish a process for which all VR program participants, including those served under contracts, are assigned to specific services and aware, or in some other mechanism that would enable the agency to satisfy all programmatic and fiscal reporting requirements. Now, you may already have this in place, but again, make sure it is in writing, okay? Also, friends, you'll need to develop policies and procedures requiring that all service providers, particularly those providing services under third-party cooperative agreements and contracts, make sure that they're submitting invoices that detail services provided to each individual and detail the amount of time spent serving each individual. This will help you gather the information necessary to ensure that all services provided are allowable and all expenditures incurred are allowable, as well as enabling you to submit the required fiscal and programmatic reports completely and accurately. Okay? So, going on, internal control, internal control, internal control. Sorry, let me go back. Skipped over for a minute. So another thing you want to consider are internal control activities for underreporting consumer services. Now, this is not just specific to your agency, friends, but something we've seen in general is that agencies appear to underreport the services provided. So if you see this, you need to analyze the data to determine why some VR services are being inaccurately reported on the 9/11. You then need to develop internal controls to ensure VR counselors are accurately recording and reporting on the IPE, the entire scope of services, whether those services are provided by outside providers or VR in-house. So for example, VR counseling and guidance. I recall Dina mentioning in yesterday's chat how you all record actual services in case notes, I believe. So keep that in mind. Think about how you're going to capture everything that you're doing. And you need to provide training to ensure that VR counselors and their supervisors actually understand the 9/11 reporting requirements. So with that, friends, I want to go on to this next slide. And on this slide, I actually have another screenshot of your RSA 9/11 data dashboard from Q2. So it just provides examples of possible underreporting. Now here you see that I've highlighted job search assistance, job placement, and information and referral services, for which you all reported no service provision in any of these areas. So this doesn't mean that this is wrong, but I will say, is this accurate? I would ask you that question. And if I was looking at the data, I would get curious myself. Is this accurate? Did we not help anyone search for a job in any capacity? Did we not provide information and referral to other entities, other organizations? So did we not have conversations about that at all? Because a lot of times you're doing a lot more than you realize you're doing, and we're just not giving ourselves enough credit for it. So again, the question, is this accurate? Maybe, maybe not. And if it's not, it's not the end of the world either way. It's just something for you all to pay attention to and validate. I also want to jump into this next slide. So just like the previous slide, I've provided a screenshot here of a piece of your data dashboard from Q2. So this slide is just an example of possible underreporting for pre-employment transition services. You all reported having 1,843 students with disabilities. But of this number, only 67 or 4% received services in quarter two. So again, the question would just be, is this accurate? Doesn't mean that it's not, but that would be a question that I would have looking at that data. And I would ask something like, so did the remaining 96% just opt out of receiving services during that quarter? So are you saying that 97% of the students with disabilities did not receive services in that quarter? Again, this is just an area for you to pay attention to. It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but it should make you curious. It should make you start to ask questions. So beyond that, friends, I want you to remember to develop and implement internal control for eligibility determination timeframes so that the field staff can track and monitor timely and untimely eligibility determinations. Also, you can assess and evaluate VR counselor performance and identify effective practices that ensure timely eligibility determinations. These include the use of your case management system tools and or supervisory review of your timely eligibility determinations. And as I mentioned earlier, you guys are actually kicking tail in this area because you had for quarter two 99.8% timely eligibility determinations. So that's great, friends. Um, I think something you want to also be mindful of, friends, is internal controls that you have in place for pre-employment transition services. So you want to develop and implement a mechanism to directly track agency personnel costs spent providing pre-employment transition services to accurately report reserve costs on federal financial reports. Remember that your pre-employment transition services are funded through that reserve fund. So you're going to have to make sure you have a way to track all of that and that you have internal controls that support that, that say, hey, you actually have everything in place for VR versus your pre employment transition services. Hope that makes sense. Another thing that you want to think about, and you're probably thinking, there are a lot of internal control. There are. And this usually can extend much longer, but for sake of time, I just kind of wanted to get through these. Um, Make sure you consider prior approval requirements. So, develop and implement policies and procedures, including a monitoring component to ensure ongoing compliance with the prior approval requirements. Um, you all can actually refer to the frequently asked questions prior approval by OSEP and RSA formula grants. And that was actually developed. It actually has been out a few years, but it was developed in October of 2019. And it is on the OSTER's website. So, friends, that was a lot. That was a lot. And I know I was probably going fast through some of that because that's the heavy lifting, the meaty stuff. Um, but now that we've done this heavy lifting and we talked about the requirements and some considerations for internal controls that you want to have in place, I want to talk about opportunities and next steps for effective implementation. And this is where I actually want to invite you guys in, and I intentionally save more time for this so that you can brainstorm and talk through what this looks like in your specific roles.
Crystal,
So, yes.
this may be a good stopping point just for a 5-minute brain reset break. And
Yeah, I
people
think
to-
they definitely do need a brain reset after all of those internal control requirements.
just thought.
So, you guys, Tina, do you want to take 5 or 10 because we have the time to spare?
You know what? Let's take 10. You want to be back at 11:10?
Okay, good. Thanks.
Excellent. We'll see you at 11:10, everyone.
I am.
Okay,
So,
excellent. Thank
okay, thanks, Tina. So, friends, first of all, I want to extend an apology to you all. I don't see the chat, I don't see anything that's going on, but I was alerted that you guys wanted me to slow down. And I know this is some heavy lifting. I will say that usually there are a lot of activities, interactive exercise involved in this training because it's such a heavy topic. And I believe it is essential or important to actually walk through some of these processes. So, with that being said, I do apologize if I was kind of Speedy Gonzalez through some of those pieces, specifically those requirements and suggestions for internal control activities. With that said, I want us to continue by jumping into some of the next steps and opportunities for you all. And I think this would also give us ample amount of time because I did want to see and open the discussion up for you all to talk about what this looks like in your agency. What are some of your thoughts? And if you're not too shy, um, for your specific role and thinking about how you play a major part in internal control, what that looks like. So, anywho, without further ado, I want to talk about some of the lessons we've learned from the field. So, friends, what we've learned with working with the states all over, and from even sitting in on some of the monitoring calls with RSA, procedures exist, friends, but they are not always well documented. So we're hearing over and over that agencies can actually describe great contract monitoring processes. That's a good example there. That agencies can describe great contract monitoring processes, but few or no processes are actually written down. So what that does is that leaves you with sort of a gap because you're relying 100% on one or two people who are subject matter experts in this area who know and retain all of this subject matter expertise. So again, this is what we're seeing, that the processes do exist. There may be internal controls already in place, but they're not often written down. We've also learned that many times agencies have a weak risk assessment or no risk assessment at all. So, for example, agencies might have case management systems for collecting and reporting data, but user acceptance testings from various roles is infrequent or non-existent altogether. So, what this often translates to is error and anomalies in reporting, either due to the system adaptations or staff not understanding how to properly use the system. Again, there could be things in place like that case management system or even accounting system. But if you haven't had user acceptance testing, if the various roles that have to be in that system have to be in that case management system, and for you guys, it's aware, right? If those various roles aren't in that system testing that before it goes live, then there is a possibility that there are going to be some kinks in the system. And we know that happens even with the best of systems, friends. There are going to be some kinks that you have to iron out. And how do you know about the kinks? Well, you test them. So that's one thing that we've learned with working with agencies, that things are in place, but there is not always testing in place to make sure that that system is functioning properly. Another thing we found is that training is not always sufficient or frequent enough for staff to remember their respective responsibilities. So, a good example of this is that maybe the central office staff can articulate the performance indicators under Section 116 of WIOA. Now, hopefully, after yesterday's training with Bill on performance accountability, a whole bunch of you can articulate some of this language. But what we see quite a bit is that usually certain people, again, serve as subject matter experts in these areas. You have a few people who can articulate that. They can tell you what the 6 indicators are. They can tell you when the reporting time frame is. They can tell you about negotiated rates and levels and all of that good stuff. But field staff are actually often not implementing processes in line with the requirements. Thus, reporting is sometimes erroneous or anomalous. Again, not necessarily the fault of field staff or anyone specifically, but we want to make sure that training is sufficient and frequent. Meaning, don't just talk about these things once every other year. I mean, it's a lot, you guys, a lot of heavy lifting, which is why we always encourage looking at this frequently. And you can break training and things down into bite sizes, which I think is always helpful. And lastly, one of the things that we found is that contract language is often completely missing or is lacking. So a good example of this, friends, is that the required federal and or state assurances are missing from contract language. So it's just not there what is required. There is a lack of defined scope of services. So there may be a contract in place, but it is not very clear what that scope of services is going to be and what that looks like. And or there is a lack of defined measurements and monitoring. So let's say you have a contract in place with a vendor, right? But that contract doesn't specifically articulate what the milestones are, when you're going to check that, who's going to check that, how they're going to check that, who's going to be responsible for what, when, and how. And, you know, in worst case scenarios, if you're not meeting certain measurements, what happens then? A lot of times we see that language like that is just completely missing. And again, this is not a nag at anyone, and this is not specific to one agency. We've seen this all over the place, but these are some lessons that we have learned and something that we think is worth sharing with you all. I think there are quite a few key considerations for you all to just chew on. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to give you a few. So, first things first, always consider what happens when the unexpected happens. So, friends, imagine this. If multiple of your subject matter experts, so that person who is the subject matter expert for performance accountability in the agency, that person who is the subject matter expert for adapting the case management system of your agency, which is aware, I believe, that person, whoever or the subject matter expert is, let's say multiple of your subject matter experts just hit the lotto at the same time. They hit the lotto for $1,000,000, gazillion, quadrillion dollars. You know, I'm just making up numbers now, but they're super duper duper rich. And they decide they want to change their contact info, right? They don't want to talk to anybody. They move to a deserted island because they're like, they're the kings and queens of the world now, and they're super duper rich. They don't have to do this anymore. So, what do you do in cases like that? And of course, I'm being very dramatic, but you need to consider that change is consistent. Change is the only thing that doesn't change, right? We can expect change. Whether that person hits the lotto or not, things happen and they retire. They don't want to work until they're 95. So they retire, they go rest, or God forbid, they pass on. Whatever the case is, what happens? How do you deal with the unexpected here? So that's something you want to be very cognizant of when you're thinking about developing your internal controls, because if nothing is written down and all of the knowledge walks outside of the door with that subject matter expert, then what? Will your baby survive? Remember, thinking of the VR program as your baby, will your baby survive if the subject matter experts walk out the door? So think about that. Do you have a contingency plan? That can look very differently depending on the role, the unit, all of that good stuff. But do you have a contingency plan? Who should people turn to? When and where? Do thresholds exist? Or are you just flying by the seats of your pants? Can you do whatever, whenever? So, do thresholds exist? Are there guidelines? Again, friends, these are just some really critical areas you want to think about, and keep in mind operationalizing this for the work you do. For those of you who are in field services, operationalizing, this for the work that needs to be done in field services, operationalizing this for the work that needs to be done within fiscal services. What does all of this look like? And if someone walked in from off the street because the subject matter experts had actually just walked out, with the person who walked in from off the street, would they be able to function and carry on? So those are important questions to ask.
Hey, Crystal.
Yes.
There was a question in the chat that I thought we should address a few slides back when you were talking about contracts. One of our field chiefs had asked, she said, just to make sure we're on the same page, when you state contract, do you mean the IPE? So I thought that would be worth clarifying.
Yes, great question. So when I say contract, I am actually talking about multiple things. First and foremost, you want to consider your contract with your vendors, whether it's a contract to provide services to a group, or whether it's a contract to just provide rehabilitation technology services, whatever it is. That first and foremost, you want to consider vendor contracts and third-party cooperative agreements, things of that sort. But also, I did mention that you should always consider an IPE, your individualized plan for employment, as a contract, because technically you are entering into a contract with your consumer, right? You guys are agreeing that this will be done within this time frame. These are the services that the VR agency will purchase and or provide. And these are the roles and responsibilities of the VR agency, of any partners as applicable, as well as the consumer. So yes, I do always argue that you consider your IPE in a contract. Now, it can be amended. We know that, right? But when I talk about looking at things as contracts, anything where you are formalizing that and you are making an agreement, it should be very clear on what the scope of services are and how you're going to monitor all of that. And that should be things that you are doing anyway. And you probably are. I don't know many agencies that, when you think, and excuse me, you all, there's some noise in the background. I don't know many agencies, when thinking of IPEs, that don't, at some level or another, measure the progress of that IPE. So I don't know if that answered the question specifically, Tina, because I can't see the question in the chat. But yes, you should consider an IPE to be not only a contract with your participant, but technically also the beginning of a contract with the actual providers that you're going to use to carry out those and execute those services. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Crystal. Raj, I'm sure you would chime in if you had any other comments there.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to contextualize it. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Tina.
Yeah. Does that make sense, Rod?
Yes, absolutely. It does. Thank you. It's the
Okay.
field staff here. I just want them to get the best out of it. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I'm sorry, you guys, for kind of rushing through some of these pieces because usually I don't have enough time to go through these. And I wanted to make sure I gave you all the information. But we live and we learn, right? Definitely ask as many questions as possible. If there's anything that I zoomed through too fast that you want me to go back and touch on it and flesh it out a bit more, tell me now, because I think we will have some time to play around with a little bit. So yeah. Now that we've talked about some of the lessons that we've learned as TA providers and as trainers, I want you guys to consider these various areas for internal controls. So, do you have internal control for reporting? So, think your RSA 911, your ETA 9169, your RSA 17, all of the various reports. These are just examples, but for anything that you're doing, and even if, friends, you have any ad hoc reports, so any internal reporting that you may be doing, I don't know exactly when and how you may be doing ad hoc reports, but if you are, even think about internal controls for those. What's the purpose of those reports? What will it serve? And then always go back to internal control as a system, right? Always go back to that, friends. So, do you have internal control for reporting? Another thing that you want to be mindful of is whether or not you have internal control for supervision chain of command. You would think, remember earlier I was saying common sense ain't coming. You would think that certain things are just common sense, but with the ins and outs of operating, some things just can easily slip through the cracks. And the various things, or the very things rather, that we don't always think about front of mind will be those things that pop up out of the blue. And you're kind of like running by the seats of your pants and flying by the seats of your pants at that point, trying to figure out how to deal with stuff. So, again, do you have internal control for supervision and your chain of command? Who is responsible for what? If this person can't do it, or if they can't be at a certain place, who steps up? You know, those things actually should be written somewhere, which is why I think the previous slide, we talked about possible contingency plans, what that looks like. Also, do you have internal control for documentation? So think about things like data validation. And I know our friend Bill will again deep dive into data validation Tuesday, which I love talking about data validation. But data validation does serve as a major part of the internal control system. So do you have internal control around that? Do you have internal control around time allocation? So let's say, for instance, you have counselors who are dedicated to both providing pre-employment transition services as well as traditional VR services. How do you allocate that? What does that look like? And another example would be documentation for credential attainment and measurable skill gains. What does that look like? What are your internal controls? And I know yesterday, I believe there was a question in the chat about what constitutes as an MSG and what does not count as an MSG. And here's the thing, there is no federal list that I can think of, and Bill, I mean, chime in if I'm wrong here, definitely. But there is no federal list that I can think of that says this is not, this is not, this is not an MSG. So that means the onus is then on you all as the parents of your VR baby to demonstrate this within your agency, to have policies and procedures that describe what credential attainment means, what MSG, measurable skill gains, means. That has to be very clear so that that could be operationalized, so that your field staff, when they are actually doing the work, they are very clear on what a credential is and what counts as a credential. For instance, even though forklift, I think that was one of the examples that I got. I think it's great for people who want to go into that. And definitely, you do not want to discourage your participants from going into a field or doing something, or receiving any type of training just because it may not count as a measurable skill gain. But when you think of credentials and measurable skill gains, you want to be able to define that it is leading to a specific occupation. So it couldn't be general in nature. Think of something like a CPR certification. I mean, that could be used in multiple fields, right? So it wouldn't necessarily count as an MSG, but there are caveats, right? There are always caveats. There are always gray areas. And this is why it is so critical for within the agency, you have policies and procedures that articulate what is, what isn't. Also, you have to be mindful of things that are required at the state level. Some states have specific programs that have been developed that could possibly be counted as an MSG, and things of that sort, or credentials. So again, you have to have internal control around this to, give instruction and direction for your staff. Another thing, friends, that you want to think about, and we talked about this, right? Internal control for separation of duties. This is closely related even to your time allocation, because let's think about it. I just keep thinking about counselors. If you have a counselor who provides VR services, but they also provide pre-employment transition services, how are those duties separated? How do you articulate when they're supposed to be doing one versus the other? Or is this all together? Again, you have to define that and what that looks like. There should be internal control, friends, around safeguarding your assets. So I really wish I could see the chat, and maybe I should have created a poll for this, but I'm always interested in hearing what agencies have to say in regards to their assets, whether or not they even consider their assets. I remember speaking with one agency before and asking them to identify what their assets were. And this was, of course, an in-person training. So we were doing a lot of interactive activities. And you guys, they named everything under the moon as an asset, except for the money. And it was really funny to me, because I'm like, okay, these are a lot of great assets. You've named yourself, which kudos to you. You are one of the greatest assets, the staff. You named the consumers, you named the partners, the employers, they named everybody, but they did not identify the money as being an asset. So I'm thinking, how are you going to provide services, friends? How are you going to purchase the services with no money? So it's always funny to hear how you guys think about that, or what you identify as an asset. I will caution you to never shortchange yourself. Okay. So another thing you should be thinking about is internal control around payment processes. Again, internal control, friend, means that it is actually a formalized process. It's a formalized system. So this is written down. What does this look like? Approval and authorization process. And I'll just add this tidbit, friends. I don't know about any of you all, but reading through a very large policy and procedure manual and digging for stuff can sometimes become difficult and arduous. And so things like job aids, little short snippets of trainings, those things are going to be very helpful as far as adding to an effective internal control system, right? Um, Think about also, friends, you want to think about internal control around reconciliation. We talked about that a few slides back, but think about what does it look like when you identify errors and anomalies, and how do you fix that? There should be a specific protocol, meaning there should be consistency there. And then what is your training plan? If you are seeing the same type of errors and anomalies quite often, are you seeing it statewide? So is this something that everyone is having an issue with? Are you seeing it in just a particular region or district? Or is it just, relegated to one counselor or one staff, So think about those things. How do you fix the errors? How do, I think I used an example earlier on of overpaying a vendor. We don't want to do that. We do not want to overpay. But if you do overpay, what is your process for remedying, the issue? So those are things that need to be clear and need to be in writing, friends. And another thing that you can think about is your compliance requirements. What are your internal control pieces around that? So around period of performance, which is a big thing, right? Determining allowability of costs. I think a lot of times when we're talking about all of these things, friends, we're either looking through it from the lens of field staff, if you're a counselor, if you're a supervisor, or you're looking through the lens of quality assurance, or you're looking through the lens of IT or fiscal, whatever your lens is. But I think what I cannot impress enough is that you all are one. And again, this program is your baby. You can't just take care of your baby's eyes, but not take care of your baby's ears, or take care of your baby's eyes and ears, but right over here, the baby is ashy. You have not lotioned the baby. There are so many various components in all of your work. The things that you do individually work collectively for this baby. So I think those are things that we cannot impress upon agencies enough. So, what I would like to do this time, we have a few minutes to play around. And if Tina, Bill, any of my friends over here, even you, Rachel, anybody would man this chat for me for just a while, I want to hear some of your actual real time concerns about maybe some possible challenges and opportunities around internal control. Um, did you ever think internal control was something that you were responsible for? What are your feelings about internal control? When you think about internal control, do you get giggly and giddy and excited? Are you excited about internal control? What are your thoughts on this? And I don't know, Tina, if you want people to unmute or you want them to just drop it in the chat. I am flexible for how you guys want to do this, but I really am curious to know what are some of your pressing concerns around internal control.
I think it's fine for folks to, if you're comfortable using the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting as part of the discussion, that would be fine. Thank you, Crystal.
Mm-hmm.
Crystal, I can start out with it's Bill,
Hey, Bill.
a question that was in the chat.
Okay.
And it does fall under the heading of internal controls in terms of defining services appropriately. So the question was how to differentiate between information and referral services and vocational rehabilitation guidance and counseling. And I would say just to begin with that, and please feel free to jump in, Crystal, but one of the things that's required in the regs is written policy governing the provision of the services. And it's dependent on the state agency to define that. So that may be something that's on the drawing board. You may have it already right now. But typically, that is defined in policies and procedure for each one of the services listed under the scope of services in the regs. I will say, just to lend some clarity to it, information and referral is primarily focused on accessing or providing customers information to be able to access community services that may be beneficial to them that are typically at no cost. It's not vocational guidance and counseling related to the goal or the development of the goal on the IPE. However, just again, the caveat is typically that is defined, and the basis for that are the definition of the services that are in the regs under its 34, 361, 48 is the regs. I did want to mention too, just in terms of regs, and maybe you're not familiar with it at all, but just what it means. So every department has federal regulations, and the first number, 34, is the regulations for the Department of Education. And then there are parts within that particular title. And the vocational rehabilitation part under 34 is 361. And then all of the point whatever are specific regulations that we're intended to follow. So we didn't talk about that yesterday, and I just wanted to clarify on that real quick. So, Crystal, anything to add with just the information referral and vocational guidance and counseling?
No, I think what you have just added, Bill, was actually wonderful. I would just second what you shared because we say this all of the time. Policy, developing your internal policy and procedure is key for this because otherwise you leave staff lingering to just kind of make the decisions on their own. And what if they make the wrong decision? And you can't fault a person for not knowing what they don't know. So this is why it is going to be very critical. And that really is what your internal control system is. It is a system developed to support all of the work that you all do as a whole and the work that you do individually and collectively. It is a system to support your baby, right? So, Bill, thank you so much for adding on to that. But I would just second what Bill has said. If you guys do not have clear guidance on what constitutes information and referral services, I think that could be like a next step. And maybe it is there, but so then that also means, okay, are we training on this enough? When we start to consider the provision of services, is everyone on the same page? Is staff all on the same page about what information and referral services actually are? And if there is any overlap with the BR counseling and guidance, because obviously there can be overlap with a lot of these services. So that's a really good point, Bill. Thank you.
Crystal, this is Max. There's
Hi,
another.
Matt.
Hi. There's another question that came in the chat, and it states, is there a way for us to learn more about how other states handle different aspects, pre-ed services, 60/90, et cetera, to see what works for them? It makes sense internal controls are necessary, but there seems to be a gap between knowing they're needed, but not knowing how to do this effectively.
Right. So I just want to make sure that I understand the question in particular. You're wanting to know, or the staff member is wanting to know about what other agencies are doing in regards to the provision of pre-employment transition services. Is that right, Max? Could you?
To handle different aspects.
The
Yeah.
cost?
So the person wrote how other states handle internal controls to track different aspects, and pre-ets was just an example.
Okay, right. And I think this is not always the answer that a lot of agencies want. Bill actually touched on this yesterday a lot when he was talking about performance accountability, because we often give you the what and why you're supposed to do it, but not necessarily the how, because every agency is so unique. There are various things that you're going to want to consider when you start developing your system, such as any of your state regulations, your system. I mean, there are always other agencies that you can look at, and we do try as much as possible to connect agencies together so that they can have conversations. But you always got to consider what resources do they have that you may not have, and vice versa. What do you have access to that they may not have access to? Because that is going to speak a lot to the language in your framework. But I will say, and Bill, please chime in afterwards to add, I will say, just as far as any internal control, yes, there are things out there and you don't want to completely reinvent the wheel if you don't have to, but you have to always be careful with that as well, because you want to make sure that it supports everything you have within your agency and what you need within your agency. I'll use even you guys, your general agency versus your blind agency. Now, I don't know for sure what case management system the blind agency has, if they have Aware as well, or if they have another system. But I've seen oftentimes in states where there are two agencies, that those two agencies have two totally different systems, right? So you even have to be careful about that when you're partnering with that agency or when you're reporting, because if their system is adapted a certain way, it's probably adapted because that's what their system allows, and your system may allow something totally different. So there is not necessarily a perfect answer for that, Max, and for whoever asks that question. But I will say, yes, we always encourage, and it depends on what you're talking about. It depends on, so you use the example of cost allocation for pre-employment transition services. Depending on what your system looks like, what you have in place, a lot of times we will try to pair you with an agency that we think is doing a good job, with the caveat of you always want to be mindful of things that are unique to your agency, to your state. Bill, I think you were about to say something, or maybe I thought you were about to say
Oh, go
something.
ahead and finish, and I'll share some perspective as well on internal controls in general.
Yeah. So that's what I was just saying. It just kind of depends, friend. I know that's not the answer you want, but it depends on what area you're looking at. If you're looking at pre-ets, if you're looking at reporting for the RSA 911, if you're looking for reporting, fiscal reporting, if you're looking for quality assurance, how you do quality assurance in the agency, that could look very different from one agency to another, because you've got to consider stuff like staff capacity. You have some agencies that have a machine and they have a full 15, 20 person team, as to where some agencies it's one person, it's two people. So there are a lot of nuances in that. But yeah, we always try to pair you with an agency that is probably as close to you as possible, with the caveat that, of course, you want to always consider your unique circumstances. And Bill, go ahead. I think that's my overview of that.
Just a little perspective on internal controls as well. And I mentioned yesterday that 2 CFR 200, which is the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, was implemented in 2014. For the most part, internal, and that's where the introduction of internal controls came.
Mm.
For the most part, for VR agencies, we were operating just in unknown territory relative to internal controls until RSA held a fiscal conference in 2018. Although there were some findings you can see it in what I shared earlier on the topical list of RSA findings, if you wanted to click on it, starting in 2017, those internal control findings started showing up. At that fiscal conference in 2018, the whole concept of 2 CFR 200 was introduced by RSA, which included the idea of internal controls.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, my experience at Michigan General, we had no idea what they were. I mean, it was an absolute learning curve of what are they, how do we document them, where do we document them, was a mystery. So there has been a learning curve to it. In terms of what we see other agencies doing, we see internal controls implemented and documented in a variety of ways. Some agencies document internal controls as a section in their policy and procedure. So you will see a policy, a procedure, and the internal control or controls set up to ensure the validity of what they say that they're going to do. It's the check. We've also seen it where agencies have internal or they have policies and procedures, and then as a standalone, there is an internal control document. So it's done in a variety of different ways. We have actually shared an example or two with some of the team on your end that we've worked with. But as Crystal said, every agency tends to do it a little bit differently. There is not a one size fits all or cookie cutter approach to how internal controls are documented and implemented.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Bill. One thing I will say on to what Bill has shared, because I think that was some really great information to flesh out there, is that as far as whether or not you are going to integrate internal controls within your overarching policy and procedures, or whether you're going to have it completely separate, as Bill just mentioned, we've seen it all sorts of ways. Again, that largely is contingent on your agency's capacity, your climate, your culture, all of that. Also, things at the state level. Some states require that your SRC, your commission, is in on developing those things. Some states are managed by an independent commission, or the agencies are an independent commission. So there are various things that will impact what that looks like, how you develop and implement all of that. Here's one thing that I'll say though, and I cannot say this enough. When you start talking about not only developing policies and procedures, but your internal control system as a whole, I think you do yourself a disservice if you do not have key players at the table. And let me tell you what I mean when I say that. If you just have a few people in leadership, your executive leadership team, and maybe quality assurance or something at the table, you have not considered some of the nuances that happen within the field where there are boots on the ground. So there needs to be someone, in my opinion, from every division, every unit within your agency represented at the table. Not saying bring everyone to the table because you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Food just gets nasty and crappy all over the place. But have a counselor at the table or someone with that perspective and someone that's not far removed from that position. If they're no longer in that position, they need to not have been far removed from that because they need to understand what the current climate of the VR world is when you talk about boots on the ground. Have someone, if you have anyone in the agency who represents employers or who works with employers, have that person at the table So when you start talking about all of these things and developing your policies and procedures around all of this, you can have unique perspectives, because there could be something that you're thinking about implementing in your head, in your mind. It seems great, right? But then when you actually implement it, the people who actually do the work, they're saying, wait a minute, this is impossible. How are we going to do this? Think about even time frames. Like, you should have internal controls in place to mitigate the risk of missing important deadlines, right? But what does that look like? Does it look like counselors must return a call within 24 hours? Or is that too short of a period? I mean, for counselors, would counselors tell you, okay, I know in a perfect world we would want to do that, but we need more like 72 hours. So these are all things that you have to consider. And it is such a heavy lift, because when we talk about developing an internal control system, friends, it's for the entire organization. It's for everything you do. And one thing that I'd like to mention, what our friend Bill just said, it's a new concept to VR. But friends, this is not a new concept, because the private sector has been developing internal control systems for umpteen years, because they are always thinking with the mindset of return on investment. And for so many years, and I'm not saying that public service isn't great. Public service is amazing. The work that we do is so amazing and invaluable. However, I think we do ourselves a disservice by not being intentional about the return on the investment. Our first job isn't in public service to make money. We know that, right? It is to provide a public service, but we have to have a way to ensure that we're doing what we say we're going to do, and that we're doing that effectively, right? So that is really, in a nutshell, what developing an internal control system is all about supporting the work you do, having a framework. Because if you don't have a framework, look at it like this. I know we talked about VR as your baby. You can also think about VR as a house, right? And if you don't have a framework in place, if you don't have all of those things in place, you just got furniture all over the place. You got your kitchen in your living room, and over there, you got your toilet right over there by the stove. You got mess all over the place. The internal control system is what gives you the foundation, what gives you the walls, what gives you the roof, what divides all of those different rooms and gives you organization, if that makes sense. I know that was a lot, friends.
Yeah, yeah, Crystal, thank you for that. First off, thank you for the great analogy of the furniture. I just laughed. Such a good analogy. The person said, thank you, Crystal and Bill, for your answers. Another person, so there's another question that came in that said, there is a history, realizing there is a history of regulations. Are there systems shared in this training retroactive to first quarter, or is integration for our state at a future date? In other words, what is the expectation for implementation?
That's a really good question. that that is a question for you all, because you all are the boss of this. We are here to partner with you and support you in any way you can. Developing an internal control system. Remember, I said I try not to give you guys false hope. It is a heavy lift, but at the same time, how everyone says Rome was not built in a day. So what you have to do, or at least what we hope to do with you guys, with your leadership team and with key players, is talk about what are your priorities? What do we know has to be done right now, immediately? And everything can't be a priority, unfortunately, friends, because if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So the point is to look at the key things that may be causing the house to burn down and try to correct some of those issues. but also just thinking about what policies and procedures need to be put in place now. What are the priorities for that? What is the training plan for that? How do you get that out to the staff and make sure everyone is on the same page? So again, unfortunately, I can't give you a black and white answer for that, friend. I wish I could, because it's going to be largely contingent on you all as an agency. You are the boss. We are just here to support you as much as we possibly can. And that is something that we do plan to have conversation with your team on. What's next? What do we need to put in place first as far as internal controls, and how do we get that out to everyone? Bill, do you have anything to add?
No, I concur. That's a leadership decision, but I will say that it's likely that there was conversations at that level to address the findings in your most recent monitoring report. And I just took a quick look through it. And for example, this is finding or corrective action 3.1.3, develop and implement an internal control process, including a monitoring component to ensure ongoing compliance with federal regulations for the areas mentioned in corrective actions 3.11, 3.12. Those are fiscal corrective actions. So, it is in RSA establishes the deadlines for these. So I'm assuming that's part of the conversation with leadership in terms of prioritizing where are internal controls necessary and what's our priority related to it.
Yeah, and if I could add as well, just from the quality assurance perspective, that one of the things, for example, that we're working on in quality assurance is kind of honing in on our case review tool. And there's always something going on that we're looking at the history with the regulations and the different internal controls and the different policies, different procedures. So I feel like it's also ongoing, and maybe it's just often behind the scenes. But Lisa, one of the examples that we have is honing in on a process for our case reviews, and that might be a good example.
I do want to add to that too. That's a really good point, Tina, that it's not a one and done process. Things are always evolving. Regulation changes, they shift, they move. There's new, like we talked about yesterday, technical assistance circulars or dear colleague letters. Those are always being released or reissued, and it does require shifting and changing policies and procedures and internal controls to keep current with those changes in the VR regs.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Bill. And, I'm kind of a little not wrapped tight, you guys. So I have to always try to bring an analogy to the table to really make it make sense. But Bill, when you say that it's not a one and done process, I think go back to our theme as VR is your baby. When you first bring a baby home, the baby is a newborn, right? The baby is wearing, the newborn diapers. Well, you can't keep the baby in newborn diapers once the baby turns a year old or 2 years. That baby is constantly growing. That baby is constantly changing. There are going to be immunizations that they need when they're a newborn, when they're just a few weeks old, that they don't need when they're 12. So things are constantly changing with your baby, the environment, what your baby needs, the clothes that your baby wear are actually constantly changing. And it's okay. We don't want people to be discouraged when there is change, because that is the whole goal of, an effective internal control system is about continuous improvement. Back to Bill's point, there is no one and done, but that's okay. That's okay. That is a good thing. The whole point is to make sure that you're keeping up with the times and the culture within your agency, the requirements at the federal level, but also the requirements within your state. And then, of course, bringing that down to the level of your agency. What worked 5 years ago may not work tomorrow, right? Just think about Bill went into prior to 2014, we were in WIA. So there was a different emphasis for the work you do. Now it's different. So you have to adjust. And, that's kind of just the name of the game.
Crystal, I wanted to back up. Raj, you had a question just about contracts, and I did add how RSA defines contracts as well. And I would draw everyone's attention, it's in the chat. But one of the things that they define as a contract is your service authorization. So going back to internal controls, and Crystal mentioned it through, I think, towards the beginning of her presentation about the importance of separation of duties. But that's a great example where it's important to have everyone doing something different in the authorization and payment process. And the need for an internal control is a safeguard against fraud, quite frankly. And I can tell you, I've had personal experience with that in the agencies that I've worked with, where we didn't have adequate separation of duties, and there was events of fraud as a result of that. And we lacked the internal controls that defined how to prevent that from happening. So a real life example.
Right. And you definitely don't want to be on the news for a major fraud incident. We have seen it before. I mean, where there have been agencies in the news for, I mean, and it is what it is. You can't go back, but that is why we talk about the three types of internal controls: preventive and detective, because preventive, detective, and corrective, excuse me. As much as possible, correction should be your last result, right? It should be what you've done after you've already had preventive and detective controls in place. And so if you have proper preventive controls in place, things to make it less likely that something is going to go wrong. And if you have proper detective controls, meaning your reviews, how are you analyzing the data? The one thing that I say to agencies, especially when it concerns your case service report, that RSA 911, that's a lot of data. If I'm not mistaken, and Bill, please chime in if I get this wrong, but I want to say that 316 data elements possible for every single participant that you have, and a lot for the reportable individuals too. So there is a lot of data you're dealing with that you're having to submit on a quarterly basis. And I would just say that I think agencies do a disservice to themselves when they wait until the last minute to start looking at their data. When you only look at the data once per quarter, when it's time to submit, a lot of things could have already slipped through the cracks. So I think it is very important, and this is going to look different depending on the position. But field staff, there are certain things that you could be looking at. And there are things also, and Dina and her team probably would be able to speak more to this, but there are things that maybe you could have access to in Aware. Like maybe there are layouts that you have access to that you can run as a supervisor, as a counselor, as a counselor's assistant, or whatever the role is, to understand where you are and how you play a role in the bigger picture. But there are things that you guys could all collectively be doing to make this baby prettier. So anything else? I cannot see questions. I cannot see chat or anything.
No additional questions.
Awesome. So with that, I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. And Bill, please chime in, and then can definitely hand it back to our friends here in New Jersey. But when you think of an internal control system, think that it is not, again, it's not just singular activities. It's not just something that maybe the chief of fiscal does, or the chief of field, or one counselor, or quality assurance, or data reporting, IT. Is not any of that. It's not something that's just relegated to your director. This is something that is the responsibility of each and every single one of you in the agency. You all have your parts. And it's like, again, the head needs the neck. The head needs the neck, the head needs the shoulders. I've heard people say things like, you got a good head on your shoulders. Well, imagine if you didn't have shoulders. So, you all of these body parts are needed. You guys all make up something to ensure that you're taking care of your baby. So you need to be very intentional about that. Obviously, it is not a one size fits all. So what works for your sister agency may not work for you, or vice versa. And even what if you take your agency and compare it to like the agency here in the state of Texas? Texas is ginormous, you guys. So there are different things and considerations that you always have to be looking at when you talk about developing your internal control system. You want to consider things again like your staff capacity. Do you have the staff that you need? And if you don't, can you get the staff? Are you providing proper training frequently enough? There are so many different things to consider in this. And this little hour and a half, 2 hour training could not answer all of the questions regarding internal control ever. Even when we do longer trainings that are several hours or over the day, there are still going to be questions because we're talking about developing a system. So I am excited about continuing the conversation with your leadership team and with any key players that are brought to the table. But I don't want anyone to be discouraged and think, you got to do all of this tomorrow or the sky is going to fall. Again, this is continuous improvement. And all of you are just as important for your baby. So that is, friends, my final thoughts on that. Bill, any thoughts? Anyone else before turning it back to our friends?
No additional ads, Crystal. Thank you so much. And TGIF, everybody.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I appreciated that segue, Crystal, into this is really okay. Thought I was muted. Okay. Sorry, it said I was muted. This is more to plant those seeds, to get you guys thinking. Again, no matter what level that you are, whether you're a counselor, whether you're clerical, whether you're putting things into aware, just thinking about the importance of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it can feel very overwhelming, but just to start thinking about what is my role every day? What is my role in inputting that data and understanding some of that data? And also that I wanted to touch a little bit more on the question that we had earlier about, do we talk to other states? Yes, all the time. We're so fortunate today. Obviously, even just the internet, just looking up what other states can do. We've also been making contacts with other states, whether it's at conferences, communities of practice through VR Tech. So we have the advantage of being able to do that. But I really also am excited about finishing up on Tuesday at 1 p.m. Module 3 in this series. And just again, appreciate everybody sitting in and pivoting with us. And it doesn't end when the training ends. If you guys have any other questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. And Crystal, any final words before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate you guys. Can't talk. I appreciate you all being patient and again pivoting to this virtual session. I know this is a heavy lift, and the conversation around internal control, it is not the most exciting. So I do appreciate you sitting through it. I try to always develop a lot of interactive activities to drive this home, but I am so appreciative that you all allow me to speak on this in this capacity. And so we are here to support you guys however you need. And again, thank you for having us.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like that is a wrap, and we're done a little bit early. So everybody have a fantastic weekend, and hopefully we'll see you all on Tuesday afternoon.
Hey.